So we will now look into theories and frameworks related to chemical and climate stressors in the Arctic. There are various theories given here. One is a threshold theory. So the overview of the theory is ecosystems have critical threshold that when crossed lead to significant changes. So what is the application in the Arctic? Temperature increase may lead to rapid permafrost melting and greenhouse gas releases. So we can use this particular theory, threshold theory, to identify what is the threshold up to which these stressors are not a problematic one. So that we can study. The second one is tropic cascade theory. So here changes at one tropic level impact multiple other levels in an ecosystem. For example, climate change alters the predator-prey dynamics, which affects the entire Arctic food web. So when something happens at one level is affecting the entire system. So that is what the theory about tropic cascade theory. And the adaptive management framework, this emphasizes the learning and adapting to changing conditions in the dynamic systems. Basically, this allows us to understand the flexible policies to manage chemical stressors based on new scientific findings. So this helps the scientists and the policymakers to make decision on what to allow, what not to allow. So that's why we say adaptive management. So that means we can adapt to the changing situations. The next one is ecological resilience theory. So this focuses on ecosystem capacity to absorb disturbances while maintaining essential functions. Even in our human body, we are fine with few changes. Even if it affects, we can still manage some of the things. Similarly, the ecosystem also will survive even if there are some disturbances occurring to the entire system. So the ecological resilience means you survive, you continue to live without much of a problem. So that's the reason this particular theory mainly uses or helps to assess how Arctic ecosystem may respond to combined stressors like temperature rise and pollution. So we can study and understand how these things are actually happening. The next one is the adverse outcome pathways. So this is related to climate changes and like molecular level interactions of chemicals with biological effects to ecological impact we can understand. This is mainly for the chemical stressor. This assesses the interactions between climate stressors and chemical toxicity in Arctic species. So both climate and chemical stressors are interrelated. The cumulative stressor theory talks about how multiple stressors can interact, leading to compounded effect. In sometimes when you say 1 plus 1 is 3, that is what is called the synergetic effect. Similar to that, the compounded cumulative stressor theory talks about when one or two things, when they combine, we actually have even more worse situations. So that is what is the compounded effect of multiple stressors. This theory talks about that. And this is what people had observed. The compounded effects are much more than the individual impacts or individual contributions. This is very crucial to understand how rising temperature and increased pollution jointly affect the biodiversity. Rather than looking at pollution as one aspect and temperature increase as another aspect, if we combine these two, we may even have a better understanding of what are the changes that are happening. Then integrated assessment model. This combines the knowledge from various disciplines to evaluate the impact of climate change and assess policy. So this can be mainly used for the policy makers. So how do we develop the adverse outcome pathways? The first 4 points we already had seen. So the GCC leads to environmental change. Then these changes directly affect or influence the health and distribution of organisms. The lack of comprehensive data tells us like we need to understand more by carrying out lots of researches. So we have to carry out integrated risk assessment of toxic chemical we have to carry out. This is the recognized need for the mechanistic understanding of how chemicals interact with the GCC related factors to inform risk assessment effectively. So finally what we are going to do, we have to create a structured approach to connect molecular and population level effect so that we understand holistically how these stressors are affecting the entire system. So this is how we focus on development of adverse outcome pathways. So what is the purpose? We can depict linkage between molecular initiating events and adverse outcomes. Both can be linked if we develop this particular pathway. Then what is the area we need to focus? One is chemical specific variables, other one is climate specific variables we can look into. Then based on that we can actually develop the adverse outcome pathways. So here we had given some information related to that. Toxicant induced climate susceptibility. So what are the changes that happens due to toxicant? One is the impact on ability to respond to GCC stressors by the species. Then what are the changes actually happening? The changes happens in the biological response, physiological response and behavioral response. This is what we had seen earlier. So what are the outcomes of accumulation? This accumulation is nothing from the climate stressor point. The toxicant is from the chemical stressor point. So accumulation means some of the species may successfully survive even though there is some stress. So that we can understand. And what is the failure? It may lead to loss of individual, loss of population, or even species extirpation or even extinction. So this is a very crucial thing. We need to understand how species is getting affected and why they die. And if we can correlate the death related to any of these stressors, then we can actually make some effect to reduce or mitigate these kind of stressors affecting the system. So what are the responses that happens in the Arctic species? One is the metabolic response. It may be a hyperphagia, shivering, estivation, hibernation, or some of the ways the species will respond. Or structural responses include metamorphosis, tissue resorption, tissue growth. And anything related to homeostatic responses. One is the water retention, ion balance, nutrient absorption, reproductive process. And with respect to the behavioral challenge, these are happening because of the stressor on the species. So the feeding, drinking, reproduction and migration behaviors of the species is getting affected because of the GCC, that is the global climate change, and each species is actually responding to the changes. Let us look at the ecological impact assessment in the Arctic. First, we need to define the objective and the scope, identify the first one is the scoping. So here we identify the stakeholders, determine the environmental components, identify potential stressors. So this is the first thing we do. Then a baseline data collection, whatever we want to do, if something is changing or not, we do need to have the data. So we do the baseline data collection. We have to conduct the field surveys for biodiversity, then collect environmental samples, use remote sensing for data collection, then finally review existing literature. Then we have to predict the impact. So how do we do that? We use ecological models for predictions, analyze data for stressor relationship, evaluate cumulative impacts and consult experts for refinement of the process. Then we carry out the impact evaluation. First we predict and then we evaluate. Once we evaluate, then we have to do the next thing is how to reduce it. So we focus on the mitigation measures or reduction measures. It can be recommend best management practice or develop restoration plans or even engage stakeholders in the strategy development. Then monitoring and follow up. We have done the mitigation. So is it actually working or not is the next one we do it, which is monitoring and follow up. And then finally report or communicate. So this is how the ecological impact can be assessed in the Arctic region. And when we measure the chemical stressors in the Arctic, we have the similar things. First we have to define the objective, then we have to identify the site, then we do the sample collection, then we have to carry out the laboratory analysis, then data interpretation, and finally reporting and communication. So how each steps are given here. For example, how do we define the objective? I define the objective as identify specific chemical stressors of concern such as heavy metals or persistent organic pollutants. So this is my definition of the problem or the objective which I am going to study. Or maybe the next one is like establish monitoring goals, including baseline assessment or impact evaluation related to specific activities. For example, oil exploration or mineral exploration. So for these kind of things, we can actually define the objective. Then we have to identify the site for selecting the samples. And when we identify the site, what we need to do is we have to consider the accessibility and the ecological significance. For example, if you look at a very remote area where no species exist, then there is no point in spending time in understanding that. We have to look at a place where lots of species live and there how the chemical and the climate stressors are actually working, because these are very resource intensive operations. So we have to consider the accessibility and the significance of why we carry out this study. And also we have to use GIS, like a geographical information systems, for spatial analysis to determine the optical sampling site. So this also is the logistical problem. So we have to keep that in mind. And then how do we collect the sample? We can collect the water samples, sediment samples, or air samples, or even ice core samples. So these are all the four major areas where we are going to study how the contaminants or maybe the chemical stressors are affecting, and similarly the climate stressors. Then we take the sample to the laboratory. We analyze the sample using advanced techniques. Then once we have the data, then we try to compare the results against the established safety protocols or thresholds, and then we evaluate the spatial temporal changes that is happening in the chemical concentration, and if we can identify a pattern, that also we try to do that. And then we identify the potential sources of contamination by correlating results with known industrial activities and environmental conditions, because we know in this particular region there are lots of oil industries or oil exploration going on. So that means the contaminants will be from those particular areas, or maybe those chemicals will be coming. So that we can easily identify and we can correlate that. Then finally we report the data, whatever we have identified. We report, for example, we prepare a detailed report or communicate the results to the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Basically the local communities, policy makers, and environmental organizations, emphasizing transparency. Many times some scientists may not report everything, so it is very essential that there is a transparency in the report of all the things whatever they have observed. Then they can propose some recommendations for mitigation measures and ongoing monitoring efforts to address identified risks.